Space above Earth is quiet. There is no sound, no atmosphere, and no familiar sense of movement. Objects drift slowly. Light behaves differently. Distance is difficult to judge. This is the environment NASA has worked in for more than 60 years. From the outside, NASA appears precise and transparent. Missions are planned years in advance. Data is collected, reviewed, and shared publicly. Every launch, every orbit, every landing is documented. NASA's public purpose has always been clear: to study space, to understand the universe, to rely on science. But space is not a controlled environment. From the earliest days of human spaceflight, astronauts and engineers encountered things they could not immediately identify. Small objects appearing near spacecraft, lights moving against the background of stars, signals that did not match known patterns. In most cases, these observations were explained. Ice particles released from spacecraft, reflections from panels, debris left behind by earlier missions. NASA expected these explanations. Space is complex, and human perception changes in orbit. But not every observation fit neatly into those categories. Some appeared briefly, then disappeared. Some moved in unexpected ways. Some were logged without conclusion. These moments were not treated as extraordinary events. They did not stop missions. They did not trigger alarms. They were recorded, reviewed, and often set aside. There was little reason to speak about them publicly. NASA was operating during the Cold War. Space was not only a scientific frontier, but a strategic one. Any unidentified object raised questions, not about visitors, but about technology. Could it be debris? Could it be equipment? Could it belong to another nation? If the answer was unclear, the observation was classified until it could be understood. Over time, these unexplained observations accumulated quietly. They were not grouped together. They were not labeled. They existed as isolated data points within mission logs and footage. NASA did not call them UFOs. That term implied conclusions NASA was not prepared to make. Instead, they remained unnamed. Unidentified observations. Unresolved recordings. They stayed within reports, transcripts, and archived footage. Above Earth, silence makes this easy. There are no bystanders in orbit, no external witnesses, and so, many encounters passed without attention, recorded, filed, and left without explanation. NASA was established in 1958, at a time when the world was changing rapidly. The Second World War had ended, but global tension had not. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing in technology, military power, and influence. Space quickly became part of that competition. From the beginning, NASA was shaped by this environment. Although the agency was civilian in nature, it worked closely with the military. Rocket technology, tracking systems, and early space research were often shared between defense programs and scientific missions. Information was carefully controlled. Not everything observed in space was intended for public release. Some data was reviewed internally. Some was classified. This was not unusual for the time. Secrecy was considered a matter of national security. Early space missions carried more than astronauts and instruments. They carried uncertainty. Engineers were operating in an environment no human had experienced before. Sensors behaved unpredictably. Cameras captured images that were difficult to interpret. Objects sometimes appeared in orbit that could not be immediately identified. Most of these were later explained. Spent rocket stages, loose insulation, fragments from previous launches. But explanations did not always come quickly. NASA developed procedures for handling such observations. Data was logged. Footage was reviewed. Engineers debated possibilities. If an object could not be identified with confidence, it was set aside for further analysis. During the Cold War, uncertainty carried weight. An unidentified object in space was not automatically treated as a mystery. It was treated as a potential risk. Could it be foreign technology? Could it interfere with a mission? Could it pose a danger to astronauts? Because of this, unusual observations were often examined quietly. NASA avoided speculation. Public statements were carefully worded. If there was no clear explanation, there was often no statement at all. This approach helped the agency maintain credibility. NASA's role was not to generate questions, but to answer them. And if an answer was not ready, silence was considered preferable to uncertainty. Over time, this culture shaped how unexplained observations were handled. They were not ignored. They were not highlighted. They were archived. These early practices would influence NASA's response to unusual encounters for decades to come. What began as a cautious approach during the Cold War became standard procedure. And as missions expanded beyond Earth's atmosphere, those procedures would be tested again and again. The first American astronauts entered space during a period of rapid experimentation. The Mercury and Gemini programs were designed to answer basic questions. Could humans survive in orbit? Could spacecraft be controlled? Could missions be extended beyond a few minutes? Everything was new. Astronauts were trained to observe carefully and report what they saw. Their radio communications were recorded. Their observations were logged in detail. Nothing was considered unimportant. During these early missions, astronauts occasionally reported seeing lights or objects outside their spacecraft. Some appeared as small points of light. Others moved slowly across the window. A few seemed to change direction. In most cases, these sightings were discussed calmly and briefly. Engineers on the ground would respond with possible explanations. Ice particles released from the spacecraft were common. Sunlight reflecting off panels or debris could easily appear unusual against the blackness of space. Often, these explanations were sufficient, but not always. In some transcripts, astronauts described objects that did not behave like expected debris. They appeared to move independently. They did not drift away as predicted. They remained visible longer than anticipated. These observations were noted. They were not labeled as encounters. They were not treated as evidence of anything extraordinary. They were simply recorded as unidentified observations. NASA's focus remained on mission safety. If an object posed no immediate threat, it did not require further action. The priority was always the astronaut and the mission timeline. Publicly, these reports received little attention. NASA press briefings focused on mission success, technical achievements, and scientific milestones. Minor anomalies were rarely mentioned unless they affected performance or safety. Internally, engineers continued to review data. Film footage was examined frame by frame. Telemetry was analyzed. If an object could be matched to known sources, it was categorized and closed. If it could not, it remained unresolved. These early sightings did not form a single pattern. They occurred sporadically. Different missions, different astronauts, different conditions. There was no reason at the time to connect them. To NASA, they were part of operating in an unfamiliar environment. Space was complex. Perception was unreliable. Data required patience. The unexplained lights did not disrupt missions, and so they did not disrupt NASA's narrative. They stayed in transcripts, in internal notes, in archived footage, quiet details from the earliest days of human spaceflight. Details that would only draw attention much later, when similar observations began appearing again. The Apollo program marked a turning point in human space exploration. For the first time, astronauts left Earth's orbit and traveled to another world. The missions were complex, high-risk, and watched closely by the entire world. Every detail mattered. NASA prepared extensively. Spacecraft systems were tested repeatedly. Communication protocols were strict. Astronauts were trained to report anything unusual, no matter how small. As Apollo missions moved beyond Earth orbit, the environment changed again. The moon had no atmosphere, no familiar reference points. Against the blackness of deep space, even ordinary objects could appear unfamiliar. During several Apollo missions, astronauts reported seeing objects or lights outside their spacecraft. Some appeared as bright points moving slowly. Others seemed to follow alongside the vehicle for a short time. A few were visible only briefly before disappearing. As with earlier missions, most of these observations were explained. Spent rocket stages often traveled along similar trajectories. Ice or debris released earlier in the mission could remain nearby. Reflections from the spacecraft itself sometimes produced misleading visuals. Mission control worked through these possibilities in real time. When astronauts asked about what they were seeing, engineers responded calmly, offering likely explanations. The conversations were technical, measured, and brief. There was no panic. In some cases, however, a clear explanation was not immediately available. The object would move out of view. The mission would continue. The observation would be logged. These moments did not interrupt the mission timeline. They did not affect navigation or safety. As a result, they received little attention beyond internal review. Over the years, fragments of Apollo audio and transcripts were revisited by researchers and the public. Some conversations were interpreted as evidence of something hidden or withheld. NASA has consistently rejected those interpretations. According to the agency, no Apollo mission encountered extraterrestrial objects. No unknown craft approached the spacecraft. No information was deliberately concealed. What remains, instead, are brief observations recorded during demanding missions in an unfamiliar environment. High stress, limited visibility, complex equipment. NASA's position has remained consistent. If an observation could not be explained immediately, it was reviewed later. If no conclusion could be reached, it remained an unresolved anomaly, not a confirmed encounter. The Apollo missions achieved their primary goals. Humans walked on the moon. Samples were returned. Data was collected. The unexplained observations did not alter that success. They stayed where they had always been, in the background, in mission records, without interpretation. Quiet anomalies, noted but not emphasized, as NASA moved forward into the next era of spaceflight. As space missions became longer and more complex, NASA relied increasingly on cameras. Cameras were installed inside spacecraft, outside modules, and on orbiting platforms. Their purpose was documentation, not discovery. They recorded launches, repairs, experiments, and the movement of equipment in space. Over time, these cameras captured more than planned activities. In orbital footage from various missions, small objects occasionally appeared near spacecraft. They moved slowly, sometimes changing direction, sometimes drifting out of frame. These objects were usually identified quickly. Ice particles released from cooling systems were common. Small fragments of insulation or paint could detach during maneuvers. In zero gravity, even tiny pieces could remain visible for long periods. NASA engineers were familiar with these possibilities. When footage showed unusual motion, analysts compared it with telemetry data. They examined lighting conditions, camera angles, and the spacecraft's movement. In many cases, the explanation was straightforward. The object was close to the camera. The motion was an illusion. The scale was misjudged. However, not every recording led to a clear conclusion. Some objects appeared to accelerate unexpectedly. Some moved against the direction of orbital travel. Some remained visible longer than debris normally would. These cases were uncommon, but they existed. NASA did not present such footage as evidence of unknown craft. Instead, it was categorized as unresolved imagery. Without sufficient data to identify the object, no definitive explanation was given. Public release of footage followed strict guidelines. NASA shared large amounts of video openly, but not every clip was highlighted or discussed in detail. Footage that showed no impact on mission safety was often archived without comment. As space shuttle missions expanded in the 1980s and 1990s, public access to footage increased. Live broadcasts became more common. Viewers around the world could watch missions in near real time. This visibility changed how the footage was perceived. Moments that had once been reviewed quietly by engineers were now seen by millions. Small anomalies that meant little operationally became points of curiosity for the public. NASA responded by offering explanations when possible. Ice crystals, lens flares, debris illuminated by sunlight. In most cases, these explanations matched the data. In a few cases, they did not fully satisfy outside observers. Still, NASA's position remained consistent. Cameras record what they see. Interpretation depends on context. Without complete data, certainty is not possible. The footage itself did not prove encounters. It recorded movement, light, distance, nothing more. And yet, over time, these recordings accumulated, forming a quiet record of moments that did not fit neatly into expected categories. Not hidden, not emphasized, simply stored, waiting for context that might never arrive. As NASA missions became more visible to the public, live communication became routine. Audio from astronauts and video from spacecraft were broadcast during launches, spacewalks, and orbital operations. For the first time, people on Earth could follow missions as they happened. These broadcasts were not uninterrupted. Signal loss was common in space operations. Spacecraft moved beyond tracking range. Satellites passed behind the Earth. Communication relied on complex networks that did not always provide continuous coverage. When feeds cut out, it was usually expected. Engineers referred to these interruptions as routine gaps. They occurred when spacecraft passed out of range, when antennas realigned, or when systems were adjusted. Most interruptions lasted only minutes. However, some moments drew attention later, when archived broadcasts were reviewed. In a few recordings, live feeds ended abruptly during discussions of unidentified objects or unusual visuals. In other cases, video cut to static or switched away without explanation. NASA has consistently stated that these interruptions were technical, bandwidth limitations, tracking handoffs, equipment adjustments. According to the agency, feed cuts were not related to the content of what astronauts were observing. From an operational standpoint, this explanation made sense. Live broadcasts were not mission-critical systems. Priority was always given to command and control channels, not public feeds. If a system needed to be reset or reconfigured, the public stream was often the first to be interrupted. Internal communications continued. This distinction is important. When public feeds stopped, it did not mean communication stopped. It meant that non-essential channels were temporarily unavailable. Despite this, some viewers interpreted these interruptions differently. They noticed patterns where feeds ended shortly after unusual objects appeared on screen. They questioned why explanations were not always provided afterward. NASA addressed these concerns cautiously. The agency emphasized that correlation did not imply intent. Live broadcasts followed technical constraints, not narrative decisions. Engineers did not monitor public reactions while managing complex missions. Most interruptions were logged and explained internally, even if no public explanation was issued. From NASA's perspective, there was little reason to address every brief loss of signal. These events were common and operationally insignificant. Still, the combination of unexplained visuals and interrupted feeds contributed to public curiosity. Not because they proved something hidden, but because they left moments unfinished. A question asked, a picture cut short, a signal lost. In an environment where clarity depends on continuous data, even brief gaps can invite interpretation. NASA continued its work as planned. Missions progressed. Systems improved. Coverage expanded. But the pattern remained. Most interruptions were ordinary. A few remained unexplained. And in those quiet gaps, speculation found space to grow. For most of its history, NASA avoided public discussion of unidentified flying objects. This was not because the agency denied unusual observations entirely, but because UFOs were not part of its scientific mandate. NASA's role was to study space, not to investigate unidentified reports without sufficient data. When asked about UFOs, NASA's responses were consistent. There was no evidence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. No confirmed encounters with non-human technology. No verified threat to astronauts or missions. This position was repeated in press briefings, interviews, and official statements over decades. NASA emphasized explanations grounded in physics and engineering. When footage showed unusual objects, the agency pointed to known causes such as ice particles, space debris, lighting effects, or camera artifacts. If an observation could not be explained immediately, NASA did not speculate. Instead, it remained silent. This silence was often misunderstood. To the public, a lack of explanation sometimes appeared deliberate. To NASA, it was procedural. Science required data, and without enough data, there was nothing to conclude. NASA also worked alongside other government agencies. Responsibility for investigating unidentified aerial phenomena in Earth's atmosphere typically belonged to the military or intelligence community, not NASA. As a result, NASA deferred questions about UFO investigations to other departments. This separation of roles was intentional. NASA focused on exploration and research. Other agencies handled defense and surveillance. When UFO reports gained public attention, NASA maintained its distance. The agency avoided language that could imply uncertainty beyond what data supported. Terms like unidentified were used carefully and only when necessary. For years, this approach remained unchanged. NASA did not deny curiosity. NASA did not promote speculation. It stayed within its scientific boundaries. This consistency helped protect NASA's credibility, but it also contributed to public frustration. People searching for answers often found carefully worded statements that offered little detail. From NASA's perspective, this was not concealment. It was discipline. Without evidence, there was no claim to make. And for a long time, that position remained firm. Over time, some of NASA's internal records became available to the public. This did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, through routine declassification, archival releases, and formal requests for information. As documents surfaced, researchers began to examine how NASA had recorded unusual observations internally. Most of these documents were not dramatic. They were technical. They were procedural. They were written for engineers, not the public. Internal notes referenced unidentified objects, unknown sources, or unresolved observations. These phrases were used carefully and without implication. They did not suggest extraterrestrial origin. They indicated that an object or event could not be identified with the data available at the time. Many of these records involved imagery. Photographs and video frames were logged alongside technical descriptions. Analysts noted camera angles, lighting conditions, spacecraft orientation, and known debris fields. If an explanation could not be confirmed, the entry remained open. This was standard practice. NASA's documentation culture prioritized accuracy over certainty. Engineers were expected to describe what they observed, not to speculate about causes. In some cases, later reviews provided explanations. In others, the records remained unresolved. Not because the observations were extraordinary, but because there was insufficient data to reach a conclusion. As these documents became public, they were often reinterpreted. Language meant for internal use was read as suggestive. Technical uncertainty was mistaken for hidden meaning. Phrases such as unknown object were taken out of context. NASA responded cautiously. The agency clarified that declassified records did not represent discoveries. They represented data points awaiting explanation. In scientific work, this distinction matters. An unresolved observation is not evidence of something unusual. It is simply incomplete information. Still, the existence of such records confirmed one thing. NASA had encountered observations it could not immediately explain. They were not erased. They were not concealed. They were documented. This documentation did not change NASA's public position. The agency continued to state that no evidence supported extraterrestrial encounters. But the records showed that NASA did not assume answers where none existed. Uncertainty was preserved. In the context of space exploration, this was expected. Space presents conditions that are difficult to replicate on Earth. Sensors behave differently. Visual references are limited. Perspective can be misleading. NASA's internal notes reflect this reality. They do not tell a story. They do not point to conclusions. They record moments when data was incomplete. And those moments, once released, became part of a larger conversation. One that would soon include voices beyond official documentation. As years passed, some individuals who had worked with NASA began to speak more openly. They were not astronauts giving public interviews. They were not officials making announcements. They were engineers, analysts, and contractors whose work had kept them behind the scenes. Most of these individuals did not describe encounters. They described processes. They spoke about reviewing footage, analyzing telemetry, logging observations that did not fit expected models. Their language was careful. They did not claim knowledge of extraterrestrial technology. They did not suggest hidden programs or secret conclusions. Instead, they spoke about moments when data did not fully resolve. Some recalled instances where imagery showed objects that could not be identified with certainty. Others mentioned discussions among colleagues about unusual readings or visual anomalies. In these conversations, the focus was always practical. Was the object close to the camera? Could it be debris from a prior maneuver? Was the lighting condition unusual? If a clear explanation emerged, the matter was closed. If it did not, the observation remained unresolved. Several former engineers described a shared understanding within NASA. Uncertainty was acceptable. Speculation was not. They emphasized that unresolved data points were common in complex systems. Spaceflight produced enormous amounts of information. Not every anomaly warranted further investigation, especially if it posed no risk. Some individuals noted that speaking publicly carried risks. NASA's reputation depended on credibility. Engineers were expected to uphold that standard even after retirement. Making speculative claims could damage professional standing. As a result, most testimonies were restrained. They did not contradict NASA's official position. They did not confirm hidden encounters. They acknowledged limits. A few described frustration. Not frustration with concealment, but with public interpretation. Technical uncertainty was often misread as secrecy. Silence was assumed to imply knowledge withheld. From their perspective, silence meant something simpler. There was nothing more to say. Without sufficient data, no responsible conclusion could be drawn. These quiet testimonies did not rewrite NASA's history. They added nuance. They showed how professionals worked within a system designed to minimize speculation and prioritize safety and accuracy. They confirmed that unexplained observations existed. They also confirmed that no conclusions were attached to them. Between those two facts lies a space that remains open, not filled with answers, not filled with claims, just data, examined carefully, and left where certainty ends. Among the more persistent questions surrounding NASA missions is the idea that some objects appeared to follow spacecraft. This claim did not originate from a single event. It emerged gradually, as footage and mission records from different eras were compared. In some recordings, small objects appear near spacecraft for extended periods. They move alongside the vehicle, sometimes maintaining distance, sometimes drifting closer before moving away. To an untrained observer, this can suggest intent. To engineers, it raises technical questions. Spacecraft travel at high speeds. Objects released nearby can remain in similar orbits for long durations. In microgravity, relative motion can appear controlled even when it is not. NASA analysts first considered the simplest explanations. Debris released during stage separation. Objects shed during maneuvers. Equipment temporarily detached. These explanations accounted for most cases. However, there were instances where motion did not align perfectly with expected behavior. Some objects appeared to change direction. Some accelerated relative to the spacecraft. Some remained visible longer than anticipated. These observations were reviewed carefully. Engineers examined propulsion data. They looked for evidence of thrust, rotation, or intentional movement. In most cases, none was found. The apparent motion could be explained by perspective shifts, camera movement, or changing light conditions. Importantly, no object was ever confirmed to perform controlled maneuvers near a NASA spacecraft. No collision risks were detected. No evasive actions were required. No mission was altered. From NASA's operational standpoint, this mattered most. If an object did not threaten safety, it did not demand further action. Public interest, however, followed a different logic. When footage showed objects maintaining proximity, viewers interpreted this as tracking. The absence of a clear explanation amplified that interpretation. NASA addressed these claims cautiously. The agency stated that there was no evidence of objects actively following spacecraft. Apparent tracking was attributed to relative motion in orbit and the limitations of two-dimensional video. This explanation was consistent with orbital mechanics. Objects in similar trajectories can appear to move together. Minor velocity differences can create the illusion of pursuit or avoidance. Still, not every observation could be conclusively categorized. Some remained unresolved due to insufficient data. No clear source. No measurable propulsion. No repeatable behavior. These cases did not form a pattern. They occurred under different conditions, on different missions, at different altitudes. Without consistency, NASA did not treat them as encounters. They were treated as anomalies. Recorded, reviewed, left open, and as with earlier observations, they did not lead to conclusions. They remained part of the quiet background of spaceflight, noted by those who examined the data closely and interpreted differently by those who viewed it from a distance. As NASA missions expanded beyond Earth orbit, attention shifted to the images being sent back from distant worlds. The Moon and Mars became constant subjects of observation. Orbiters mapped their surfaces. Landers and rovers captured thousands of photographs. Every image was processed, cataloged, and analyzed. Most of what these cameras recorded was expected. Craters, ridges, shadows shaped by low-angle sunlight. But occasionally, images appeared that were difficult to interpret. On the Moon, some photographs showed shapes that looked geometric. Straight lines where none were expected. Bright objects casting unusual shadows. In a few cases, features appeared briefly and then were not visible in later images. On Mars, rover cameras captured rocks with unexpected forms. Reflective surfaces. Shapes that seemed artificial at first glance. Distant silhouettes on the horizon. NASA scientists approached these images cautiously. Planetary surfaces are deceptive. Without atmosphere, shadows are sharp. Lighting angles exaggerate depth. Dust and erosion can create patterns that resemble familiar objects. This phenomenon is well known. Human perception looks for meaning. Patterns are recognized even when none exist. NASA refers to this as pareidolia. Engineers and geologists examined questionable images using multiple methods. They compared angles. They reviewed raw data. They checked later photographs of the same locations. In nearly all cases, ordinary explanations emerged. Rocks shaped by erosion. Lighting artifacts. Image compression effects. When these explanations were confirmed, the images were reclassified and the matter was closed. Still, not every anomaly could be revisited. Some images were taken once and never again. Some areas were not photographed from the same angle. In those cases, no follow-up data existed. NASA did not label these images as evidence of structures or technology. They were cataloged as unusual features. Uncommon, unclear, unverified. Public reaction followed a different path. Images circulated online. Cropped sections were highlighted. Comparisons were drawn. Questions were raised about what NASA might be overlooking or choosing not to emphasize. NASA responded by reaffirming its process. Images are released publicly. Data is shared openly. Interpretations are grounded in geology and physics. Without repeatable evidence, no extraordinary conclusions are made. This approach frustrated some observers. They expected certainty where none could exist. NASA remained consistent. If something could not be confirmed through multiple observations, it could not be treated as discovery. The Moon and Mars continue to be studied. New images replace old ones. Higher resolution reveals detail. Explanations improve. But among the vast number of photographs, a small number remain difficult to explain completely. Not because they show something hidden, but because space exploration does not always provide complete information. And in those gaps, interpretation depends on perspective. Although NASA is a civilian agency, it has never operated in isolation. From the earliest days of space exploration, NASA worked alongside the military. This cooperation was practical, not secretive. Tracking spacecraft, monitoring objects in orbit, and maintaining communication networks required shared infrastructure. Radar systems, ground stations, orbital tracking data. Much of this capability already existed within military programs. Organizations such as the U.S. Air Force and NORAD were responsible for monitoring objects in Earth's atmosphere and near-Earth space. Satellites, debris, and unidentified aerial objects were tracked continuously. NASA relied on this data. When a spacecraft launched, its trajectory was monitored by multiple systems. If an unknown object appeared near a mission, information could be cross-checked between civilian and military sources. This coordination was routine. It did not imply joint investigations into unknown craft. It did not suggest hidden agendas. It reflected the reality that space is shared and crowded. Thousands of objects orbit Earth. Active satellites. Inactive satellites. Fragments from decades of launches. Keeping track of them requires constant surveillance. When unidentified objects were detected, responsibility depended on location. Objects within Earth's atmosphere typically fell under military jurisdiction. Objects beyond that boundary were evaluated based on mission relevance and safety. NASA focused on risk. If an object posed no threat to a spacecraft, it did not require immediate action. Military agencies assessed potential security concerns separately. Information sharing followed established protocols. NASA did not control military data. The military did not control NASA's scientific conclusions. Each organization maintained its role. Over time, this separation created confusion among the public. When reports of unidentified objects emerged, people often assumed NASA held complete information. In reality, relevant data was distributed across multiple agencies, each with different priorities. This structure limited what NASA could say publicly. If an observation involved military sensors or classified systems, NASA could not comment freely. Silence was sometimes the result of jurisdiction, not concealment. NASA acknowledged this indirectly. The agency explained that it did not investigate aerial phenomena within Earth's atmosphere and deferred questions to defense authorities. This distinction mattered. NASA explored space. The military monitored airspace. Where those domains overlapped, communication was careful. As public interest in unidentified phenomena grew, this complex data network became more visible. Questions were no longer directed at one agency, but at the system as a whole. And slowly, pressure began to build for greater clarity. Not answers, not conclusions, but understanding of how information moved and where it stopped. For many years, NASA's position on unidentified phenomena remained unchanged. Then, in 2017, something shifted. A series of reports revealed that the U.S. Department of Defense had quietly studied unidentified aerial phenomena through a program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Shortly after, several videos recorded by Navy pilots were officially released. These events did not originate from NASA, but they changed the environment NASA operated in. For the first time, unidentified objects were being discussed openly at a federal level. Military officials acknowledged that some encounters could not be explained with available data. The language was careful, but the acknowledgement itself was new. Public attention increased rapidly. Questions that had once been directed toward fringe communities were now asked in mainstream settings. Congressional hearings were held. Government officials spoke publicly about uncertainty. NASA could no longer remain entirely separate from the conversation. The agency responded cautiously. NASA did not confirm extraterrestrial encounters. NASA did not revise its past statements. Instead, it clarified its role. NASA emphasized that its expertise lay in data analysis, Earth observation, and space science. If unidentified phenomena existed, NASA could help study them scientifically, without speculation. This marked a subtle change. NASA began to engage, not by making claims, but by acknowledging questions. The term UFO was gradually replaced with UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena. This shift removed assumptions and focused attention on observation rather than interpretation. NASA officials stressed that uncertainty was not evidence. Unidentified did not mean alien. Unexplained did not mean impossible. It meant more data was needed. This approach aligned with NASA's long-standing culture, but the openness was new. For the first time, NASA participated in public discussions about unidentified phenomena without distancing itself entirely. The agency positioned itself as a scientific contributor rather than an observer on the sidelines. This shift did not bring answers. It brought structure. NASA supported efforts to improve data collection. It encouraged standardized reporting. It acknowledged that some observations remained unresolved. And in doing so, it signaled a change in tone, not from denial to confirmation, but from silence to engagement. The quiet questions that had existed for decades were now part of an official conversation, one that was still cautious, still measured, but no longer entirely closed. In 2022, NASA took a formal step. The agency announced the creation of an independent study team focused on unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP. This decision was not a response to a single event, but to a growing recognition that unexplained observations required a structured, scientific approach. NASA was clear about the purpose of the study. It was not an investigation into extraterrestrial life. It was not a review of past UFO claims. The goal was narrower: to examine how data related to UAP was collected, to identify gaps in observation, to recommend better methods for analysis. The study team consisted of scientists, engineers, and experts in data processing. Their work was unclassified and independent from military intelligence operations. NASA emphasized transparency. Meetings were announced publicly. Objectives were clearly stated. Findings would be shared openly. The team reviewed existing data sources, satellite imagery, radar systems, aviation reports, Earth observation platforms. They noted a consistent problem. Most UAP reports lacked sufficient data. Many observations were brief. Sensor coverage was limited. Context was missing. Without multiple points of reference, reliable conclusions could not be drawn. The study did not attempt to explain individual sightings. Instead, it focused on improving future observations. NASA recommended standardized reporting, better sensor calibration, and the use of advanced data analysis tools. In 2023, the team released its report. The conclusions were measured. No evidence was found to support extraterrestrial origin. No data suggested advanced non-human technology. At the same time, the report acknowledged uncertainty. Some observations remained unexplained due to insufficient information. NASA framed this uncertainty carefully. Unexplained did not mean extraordinary. It meant incomplete. The agency reiterated that science progresses through better data, not assumptions. The creation of the UAP study team marked an important shift. NASA was not claiming answers. NASA was building a framework, a way to examine the unknown without speculation. For the first time, unexplained observations were not dismissed or ignored. They were treated as a data quality problem, not a mystery. And with that, NASA returned to its core principle. If something cannot be explained today, the solution is not belief. It is better observation tomorrow. As interest in unidentified phenomena grew, attention increasingly turned to one question: what can actually be verified? NASA has always placed clear boundaries around its conclusions. Verification requires data that can be tested, reviewed, and repeated. Without these elements, an observation remains uncertain, regardless of how compelling it may appear. In reviewing decades of material, NASA identifies several categories of verifiable information. First, there is documented footage. NASA has released thousands of hours of video from space missions. This footage shows objects moving near spacecraft, changes in lighting, and unexpected visual effects. What can be verified is that these recordings exist and that they capture real events. What cannot always be verified is the nature of what is being seen. Video alone does not provide distance, scale, or intent. Without supporting sensor data, interpretation remains limited. Second, there are mission logs and transcripts. Astronaut communications are recorded and archived. These records confirm that astronauts sometimes reported objects or lights they could not immediately identify. The wording is factual and cautious. These records verify observation. They do not verify explanation. Third, there is sensor data. Radar, infrared, and optical sensors collect vast amounts of information. In some cases, data confirms the presence of objects whose origin or behavior is unclear. In many other cases, sensor limitations prevent precise identification. NASA acknowledges these limits openly. Data gaps exist. Coverage is incomplete. Resolution varies. Without consistent, multi-sensor confirmation, conclusions cannot be drawn. Importantly, NASA has found no verified evidence that any observed object represents non-human technology. No confirmed propulsion systems beyond known physics. No repeatable patterns of intelligent control. No material samples of unknown origin. This does not mean that all observations have been explained. It means that explanation requires standards that have not yet been met. NASA's approach remains unchanged. Claims require evidence. Evidence requires verification. Until those requirements are satisfied, observations remain classified not as encounters, but as unresolved data points. This distinction matters. Verification does not remove mystery. It defines its boundaries. And within those boundaries, NASA continues its work. Carefully, methodically, without assumptions. Today, space is no longer an empty frontier. Earth's orbit is crowded. Thousands of active satellites operate above the planet, joined by inactive satellites and fragments from decades of launches. Space is constantly monitored, tracked, and managed. NASA operates within this environment every day. The International Space Station orbits Earth continuously. Astronauts live and work in space for months at a time. Experiments run around the clock. Cameras record routine activity. Sensors collect constant streams of data. This level of observation is unprecedented. Compared to earlier decades, NASA now has more information than ever before. High-resolution cameras, advanced tracking systems, and improved data analysis tools reduce uncertainty. Many things that once appeared unexplained are now understood quickly. Reflections are recognized. Debris is tracked. Sensor errors are identified. Modern systems provide context that earlier missions lacked. At the same time, the volume of data has increased dramatically. With more sensors comes more noise, more opportunities for anomalies. Not because space has changed, but because observation has intensified. NASA acknowledges this openly. The agency now treats unidentified observations as a data management challenge rather than a mystery. The question is no longer what is it, but what information is missing. Modern reporting systems reflect this shift. Pilots, astronauts, and researchers are encouraged to document observations without stigma. Reports are analyzed statistically rather than individually. Patterns are prioritized over isolated events. This approach reduces speculation. Anomalies are expected in complex systems. Most are resolved. Some remain open due to limited data. NASA does not frame these as encounters. They are part of operating in a dynamic, monitored environment. Importantly, modern NASA operates with greater transparency. Footage is released more frequently. Reports are discussed openly. Limitations are acknowledged publicly. This openness does not mean certainty has increased. It means uncertainty is handled differently. Instead of silence, NASA now provides structure. Instead of dismissal, it offers process. Space today is quieter. In one sense, not because questions have disappeared, but because they are examined carefully, without urgency or assumption. And as observation continues, NASA remains focused on its primary goal, understanding the universe through evidence. Nothing more, nothing less. Despite advances in technology and decades of observation, not everything recorded by NASA has been fully explained. This is not unusual. Complex systems produce anomalies. Space is an environment where conditions change rapidly and data is often incomplete. Some observations fall between categories, resisting clear identification. These unresolved cases are few, but they exist. They do not share a single pattern. They do not repeat in predictable ways. They do not point to a common source. Some involve brief visual sightings. Others involve sensor readings that lack sufficient context. A small number involve both. What they have in common is limitation. Limited duration. Limited resolution. Limited supporting data. NASA does not group these observations together. Each is treated individually, evaluated on its own terms. Without enough information, no conclusion is drawn. This approach often frustrates those seeking definitive answers. Unexplained does not satisfy curiosity. It does not confirm expectations. But from a scientific standpoint, it is the most accurate classification available. NASA avoids filling gaps with assumptions. The agency does not attribute unexplained observations to unknown technology. It does not dismiss them outright either. They remain unresolved. Over time, some cases are revisited. Improved tools provide new insight. Better data resolves older questions. Others remain open indefinitely, not because answers are hidden, but because evidence is absent. This distinction is central to NASA's philosophy. Mystery is not a problem to be solved quickly. It is a condition that exists until understanding improves. In space exploration, patience is a requirement. The unexplained encounters do not suggest intent. They do not suggest communication. They do not suggest presence. They suggest complexity. And complexity does not yield to speculation. It yields to time, data, and careful observation. NASA continues to collect information, not to confirm beliefs, not to satisfy curiosity, but to reduce uncertainty. And until that uncertainty is reduced, some encounters will remain what they are: unresolved, undramatic, quiet. As night settles over Earth, the work in space continues. Satellites remain in orbit. Instruments collect data. Astronauts move carefully through routines that have become familiar through repetition. Above it all, space remains unchanged. Silent. Vast. Indifferent. NASA's story of unidentified encounters does not end with answers. It ends with process. Over decades of exploration, the agency has observed more than it can fully explain. Not because something is being hidden, but because understanding space is gradual. Data arrives in fragments. Context is incomplete. Perspective is limited. This is the nature of exploration. What remains unexplained is not evidence of something unknown. It is evidence of what is not yet understood. NASA has chosen restraint over speculation. When certainty is unavailable, the agency waits. When data is incomplete, it records and moves forward. This approach is not designed to satisfy curiosity. It is designed to preserve accuracy. In the quiet of space, most things pass without meaning. Light reflects. Objects drift. Signals fade. Only occasionally does something remain unresolved. And when it does, NASA does not fill the silence. It listens. As observation continues, some questions may eventually find answers. Others may remain open indefinitely. That is not failure. It is honesty. Space does not offer conclusions easily. It offers distance. It offers time. And in that distance, the unanswered becomes part of the landscape. For those on Earth, looking up into the night sky, it is easy to imagine more than what is known. That impulse is human. NASA's role has never been to discourage wonder, only to ground it. So the encounters remain where they began. In data, in records, in quiet moments between certainty and curiosity. And as the Earth turns, and space continues without pause, the silence above remains. Unbroken. Unresolved. Still. Good night.